You know, I keep seeing this fantasy pop up online that one day people here in America, or basically anywhere else in the West, are just basically going to rise up, overthrow the corrupt elites, and rebuild something even better. I'm just going to say it. That's never going to happen. Not here, not now. And if you think it will happen, I'm sorry, you're basically just coping. Because reality is, the problems people face in every Western nation they live under have become so common and so absurd that most people just basically shrug it off now. And because of that, trust in the system has for the most part completely collapsed. People now know voting for Team Red or even Team Blue never actually changes the direction of the country. Maybe there's a small shift for one election cycle, sure, but it always snaps back to the same policies, the same outcomes, and the same elites still in control. Now, try to picture a world, our world, where resistance itself has been made to feel pointless, where the systems of control are so intricate, so widespread, and that even thinking about rebellion feels like some old, outdated fantasy. That's the reality we live in, folks. A reality where the ruling class holds unprecedented power, backed by wealth, surveillance, and a monopoly on force so complete that meaningful opposition is basically near impossible. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly why the West will never see a real revolution, starting with the uncomfortable truth that revolutions aren't really bottom up in the first place. Now, the idea of people rising up and taking down corrupt governments sounds very powerful and very beautiful, but it's mostly a myth. Historically, the biggest revolutions weren't even driven purely by the masses. They were basically enabled or even directly funded by wealthy elites who had something to gain from basically regime changes. The American Revolution, it was basically led by colonial elites, wealthy landowners, slaveholders, and the merchants themselves, who were more concerned about taxation and trade controls than grassroots freedom. Now, in the French Revolution, Enlightenment ideals were the major factor, but many of the revolution's earliest backers were disillusioned members of the elite high class. Even the Russian Revolution saw Lenin himself returning from exile with the backing of the German government, not the peasant class. These weren't spontaneous uprisings, they were basically strategic power shifts backed by money, ideology, and the elite's interest. And that really hasn't changed at all. In modern times, any major systematic upheaval still depends on the backing of some part of the elite class, whether that's military generals, media power players, or basically the financial backers. Without them, nothing happens. Regular people protesting in the streets, even in massive numbers, don't topple regimes unless power brokers split or basically step aside. That's the harsh truth here. And today in the West, the elite class is more consolidated than ever before. You have corporations, politicians, and even the intelligence agencies all moving in lockstep. There's no fracture, no civil war among the ruling class. And without that, revolution isn't just unlikely, it's structurally impossible. And that right there, folks, is why the elites have always been the ones to decide when, where, and to whom a revolution will happen to. Because in this day and age, people still cling on to the idea that if we all just rise up, we can change the system and our lives for the better. I hate to break it to you, but that's not how it works, unless the elites themselves have something to gain from it. So honestly, I wouldn't even use the word revolution in a modern political discourse anymore. It's not the poor or lower middle class making the changes. It's a forced shift by the political elite. Plain and simple. Now, sure, in ancient history, you could argue rebellions or uprisings brought true societal changes. Even Karl Marx himself pointed out one particular case, the Roman slave rebellion led by Spartacus himself. But even that ended in failure. The Romans hunted him and his men down to the last man. So maybe back then it was easier to start an uprising, but I still wouldn't call it a revolution. Because you have to understand, even protesters, which we are allowed to do, and I'll say it again, allowed to, only get their attention for basically a mere moment. And let me ask you all this. Do you actually think they care about solving the deeper problems for their own citizens? No, not in America. Not anywhere else for that matter. And no protests or violent uprisings will work in first or even second world countries. And I'll cover why in another video. The only real political change that happens is if the elites themselves have an internal civil war, like the French Revolution, or if the country collapses economically and socially. But for now, The media, lobbying, and global finance keeps the elites locked in place. The only light at the end of the tunnel is if someone is born into their ranks or claws their way to the top. But even then, the real question is, how far would you go once you're there? But the elite unity itself isn't the only thing stopping change. Even if the cracks did form at the top, the people at the bottom still aren't in shape to even rise up at all. And that's not just because of fear, it's because of comfort. Western governments have mastered a new model of control, not through brute force, but through comfort. Basic needs are met just enough to avoid panic. People might be angry about the cost of living, the job market, or being ignored by the politicians, but they still have food delivery, streaming platforms, and the illusion of choice. The soft suppression works better than any military crackdown. It basically sedates discontent. And the system itself has built an enormous infrastructure to keep it that way. As of 2023, the US spends over $135 billion annually on policing and domestic surveillance. There are thousands of agencies with overlapping authority, and nearly all large protests or activist movements are basically monitored, infiltrated, or even suppressed before they reach critical mass. What's scary is that this managed stability doesn't actually fix anything. The job prospects for young people is still collapsing, wages aren't keeping up with inflation, the political elite is more detached than ever before, yet the average person doesn't revolt because they're so isolated, distracted, and or convinced resistance is hopeless. And in a way, they're right. The system isn't designed to absorb complaints without changing. If people are just mad online or marching once a year, the gears keep turning. It's not apathy, it's exhaustion. Most people feel like something's deeply wrong, but they also feel powerless to do anything about it. That's not a failure of democracy, that's a failure of the current model. I believe that comfort absolutely breeds apathy, in my opinion, in its fullest, for any society. And I'm talking about first world and mostly second world countries. I think we can exclude third world countries from this, because those countries are, how would you say, very easily exploitable for revolutions to even happen, simply due to massive inequality of life and livability. Now, from a first world perspective, and yeah, I live in a first world country, I can tell you this. Comfort is something people will never give up, even if they're watching others suffer as well. As long as someone can enjoy their life, whatever that means to them, they will tolerate almost anything. To put it simply, with the economy, social, and cultural issues where they currently are at, people will still tolerate it as long as they can watch their football games and get McDonald's once a week. That's how the modern system works, folks. By keeping people fed with Amazon packages, fast food, and just a little bit of enough comfort to make them feel stable. Let's also be real, people aren't going to just get up and start protesting or starting a revolution. At most, they'll complain online or just rant on state-run media, knowing fully well nothing's going to change. And with privacy being targeted the way it is, it's harder than ever to even call out the problems, let alone walk outside to even protest. Even when you try to find solutions, whether it be pragmatic ones like through the democratic process, the political elite will shut that down anyways. Doesn't matter if it's through the system as it was designed or through non-democratic means. Because when you step back, it's oppression on two fronts. The first being your lifestyle and mindset, which you would have to actually change. And the second being the system itself, which blocks any meaningful change that is needed. And again, it still comes down to the elites deciding if change happens at all. Which for us, good luck getting any of that. Just due to the fact that the elites themselves are all interconnected when us, the average citizens, are not in any way like they are. Now, while Western citizens are basically stuck in this numbing cycle, the idea of revolution is still alive, just not where you would expect it to be, because today's revolutions aren't coming from within the West. They're being outsourced. In the 21st century, revolutions have become a tool for foreign policy, especially for Western powers. The United States and its allies have helped engineer regime changes in countries like Ukraine, Libya, Syria, and even Georgia by backing protests, funding opposition groups, and using media to shape public perception. These are known as color revolutions. Movements that, while grounded in real grievances, are often hijacked by external actors for geopolitical gain. They happen in regions where Western powers want to destabilize or basically reshape governments. But here's the catch: those tactics are only ever used abroad. The same intelligence and NGO networks that fuel instability elsewhere are never allowed to operate at home. The Western elites have drawn a hard line. Chaos is to be exported only. The United States would never tolerate a foreign backed protest movement inside its own borders, even if the grievances were real. The irony is brutal. While the West positioned itself as the champion of democracy, it uses revolution as a weapon to remake other nations, not to empower its own people. Oh no. And the result is global double standards. If you live in a poor or geopolitical weak country, revolutions can be triggered or crushed with a snap of a finger in Washington or even in Brussels. But in the West, there's a massive firewall, and no outside force is coming to liberate the American or even the European working class from their own systems. Now, for me personally, I don't see a color revolution or even your typical socialist or reactionary right type of revolution happening here in America or in the West in general. Because you have to understand, in today's geopolitical climate, a revolution is not something that will happen in a first world country or even in a second world one as well. Far from it. The political elite would never allow something like that in their own front yard. But best bet, they will for sure sponsor one in your front yard or someone else's backyard, without hesitation, of course. And that's what most people don't get. Just because it happens in a third world country doesn't mean it's going to happen in America, Britain, or even France. Just take a look at what happened with Elon through Doge, exposed the American government through NGOs and the US aid debacle that was used in backing unnatural protests in other countries. Protests that spiral into revolutions that can lead to civil wars or full-on regime change for that matter. It's a weaponized way of changing a government's mind, getting them to follow what the Western political elites want. And like I said earlier, it's far more common in second and third world countries, never in first world ones. Just take a look at the Arab Spring, for example, starting in the end of 2010 and ending just last year, with Syria being the last to hold out. The Western political elites did it for access, control of resource, and strategic positioning against countries they see as threats. Also, last year they even tried one in Georgia, but that failed because Georgia remembered what happened in Ukraine in 2013. And well, they didn't want more trouble with Russia as is. And speaking of Ukraine, that was one of the biggest ones, funded and supported by Western elites to box Russia in through false promises of EU and NATO membership. That was a calculated balance of power move to keep Russia out of European affairs entirely. So now, with all of that in mind, ask yourselves this: if you don't have money or means to revolt, what makes you think it will actually happen here? So even if, let's say, a revolution wasn't suppressed, and even if the elites stepped aside or chaos leaked back home, there's still one last problem here. No one's unified enough to even pull it off. Every major revolution in history succeeded because there was a unifying cause. Something so clear and powerful that it cut across class, tribe, and even ideology. The French rallied around bread, liberty, and equality. The Russians rallied around land and anti-war sentiment. Even the American colonies had a singular rallying cry: no taxation without representation. Today, that kind of unity is gone. The West is totally fragmented, politically, culturally, and economically. In the United States, a 2024 Pew study found that 78% of voters believe the country is more divided now than at any point in their lifetime. And that's not just with the political parties. It's identity, values, even truth itself. This divide isn't accidental. It's been engineered by decades of cultural war politics, algorithmic polarization, and elite distraction tactics. When people are fighting each other over social issues, they don't have the energy to even fight the system that keeps them all down. There's no shared revolutionary identity, no common us to rise up, and so nothing happens. People stay angry in private, scream at each other online, and retreat to their own corners. Meanwhile, the system, broken as it is, continues to be untouched, because without any unity, even the most justified revolution dies in silence. That's the tragedy of the modern West. A society too aware to be fooled, but too divided to even resist. Yeah, I agree. We're way too divided on most things, especially in Western countries. But we are united on one thing. We know exactly where we stand against those in charge. That's a good thing, actually. But let's be real, that's probably the only thing civilians in the first world countries agree on politically. Beyond that, we're still way too divided for anything serious to happen. Not that I want it to happen, of course. Take America, for example. Massive divisions over political and economic policies, freedom of speech interpretations, and cultural norms, even down to what should be taught in schools and how people should act in public. All of this is just basically a distraction from the real issues here, and that would be the economy and foreign policy adventures. Like I said before, those two are the only things actually uniting people right now. Everything else, yeah, no, still too divided. And that division is exactly what works for the political elite. While we're busy fighting each other over the mess they created, they're moving power around through democratic process without us paying attention. Not a new tactic, by the way, but with technology, it's way easier for them to pull off. People are just so burnt out on protesting. And let's also be real here, the political elite tend to favor the left slightly more than the right when it comes to these protests. That's just an observation based on what they're doing. And now, anyone who takes part in a protest or so called revolution is quickly labeled as government controlled agent or agents. Take Occupy Wall Street back in 2011. They protested the banks, but it looked like the government was monitoring them the entire time. You could argue some government operatives were even inside the movement keeping tabs. So, outside of identity politics and the culture war, I don't see any of this realistically becoming a united front for any real change in society anytime soon. So, with all of that said, revolutions in their modern concept, where people think they can just happen in first world countries, are mostly just coping, but coping with a little bit of hope mixed in it. And what I mean by that is the hope that things will get better at the end of the tunnel, when in reality, it's always been pure escapism from the real issues affecting all of us right now. There is one last thing I forgot to mention. Let's say, hypothetically, a revolution does happen. Do you really think replacing the current political elite would be any better than the ones we already have? Some might even say, it's better to keep the enemies you do know than the ones you don't. Now, put all of this together. With the elites holding control at the top, their use of comfortable suppression of the masses, revolutions being exported to target countries, but never allowed to happen at home, and our deep cultural fractures that keep people divided, possibly until one ideology takes over, you end up living in this reality. It's not just that a revolution isn't happening, the conditions for one doesn't even exist anymore in a first or even second world country, which raises a hard question. One I want all of you guys to ask yourselves. If a revolt has been engineered out of existence, what does real change even look like now? Now, for my next video, I will be covering the Civil War pundits' favorite scenario, one that will never happen in any first or even second world countries. Other than that, guys, if you liked the video, hit the like button and the subscribe button, and please leave a very interesting comment because I do want to get your guys' opinion on this. I'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, have a great day, guys.